West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Chef Justice Putnam. netrootsradio.com.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. À fleurs sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire.
Today, at least 4 members of the United States Supreme Court agreed to hear Donald Trump's appeal, arguing that presidential immunity protects him from criminal prosecution for the charges filed by Jack Smith against Donald Trump for crimes leading up to and on January 6th. It takes only 4 members of the court to agree to hear a case, and of course it takes a majority of 5 members of the court to issue an opinion in the case. The Supreme Court threw out half of Donald Trump's appeal today and granted a hearing on the other half of the appeal. The part of the appeal that the Supreme Court threw out today was Donald Trump's claim of double jeopardy on the basis that he is now being prosecuted for some of the same crimes he was charged with in his second impeachment trial in the United States Senate, in which a majority of senators voted to find him guilty, but not the 2/3 necessary to convict him. The Supreme Court gave Trump's lawyers 3 weeks to submit their brief and gave Jack Smith then 3 weeks to reply to the Trump brief. Then the Trump lawyers will get a final week for a final written reply. And a week after that, the Supreme Court will hear the arguments in the case on April 22nd. The Supreme Court is not being asked to provide total and absolute immunity for any and all possible criminal conduct by a president. The Trump petition to the Supreme Court only asks for immunity for a president's official acts or, quote, those performed within the outer perimeter of his official responsibility. The argument Trump's lawyers make before the Supreme Court could be a rerun of some of what we heard in the appeals court.
Could a president order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival? That's an official act in order to SEAL Team 6?
He would have to be and would speedily be, impeached and convicted before the criminal prosecution.
What if he weren't? There would be no criminal prosecution, no criminal liability for that?
Chief Justice's opinion in Marbury against Madison and our constitutional tradition and the plain language of the impeachment judgment clause all clearly presuppose that what the founders were concerned about was not.
I asked you a yes or no question. Could a president who ordered SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival who was not impeached, would he be subject to criminal prosecution?
If he were impeached and convicted first. And
so your answer is no.
My answer is qualified yes.
Jack Smith won a procedural point with the Supreme Court today. Donald Trump's lawyers were not actually asking for the Supreme Court to hear the case now. The Trump lawyers were asking for the Supreme Court to send the case back to the Circuit Court of Appeals for another hearing there before the full 11 judges of the Circuit Court of Appeals. In Jack Smith's brief to the Supreme Court, Jack Smith argued that there was no need for the Supreme Court to hear the case at all. But if the Supreme Court was inclined to hear the case, Jack Smith asked the Supreme Court to not send the case back for another round at the appeals court, but to set an expedited hearing at the Supreme Court, schedule that expedited hearing, and that is what the Supreme Court has now done. Leading off our discussion tonight is Neil Katyal, former acting U.S. Solicitor General and host of the podcast Courtside with Neil Katyal. He is an MSNBC legal analyst. And Neil, I want to begin the way all lawyers begin when they get these notices from the Supreme Court that they're going to hear your case. The Supreme Court identified for the lawyers on both sides the question and the only question they want to hear addressed. And I'm going to give that question to the audience now. The question is whether, and if so, to what extent, does a former president enjoy presidential immunity from criminal prosecution for conduct alleged to involve official acts during his tenure in office? How would you address that question?
Well, if I'm Jack Smith, the prosecutor here, I would say absolutely not, or maybe heck no, and just point to the proud tradition of our Constitution, which is at its essence, Lawrence, there's one central idea, which is no person is above the law. And what Donald Trump has done throughout his presidency, before and after, is always basically his arguments amount to, I'm above the law. So when he was president and there was the Mueller report, which outlined 10 crimes he had committed, he said, you can't indict me because I'm a sitting president. He then gets voted out of office, and then he commits crimes on January 6th to try and stay in office. And he says, you can't prosecute me because I'm still a sitting president. So then Congress goes and tries to impeach him for this, and his lawyers go to the Senate and say, oh no, you can't impeach him. You can only prosecute him after he leaves office. So then Jack Smith does exactly that. They prosecute him after he leaves office, and he says, oh no, you can't prosecute me because I was impeached before and I wasn't convicted, so now I can't be prosecuted. It's all just a big shell game. It always adds up to the same thing. Donald Trump evades the law. And unfortunately today, Lawrence, the Supreme Court put its thumb on the side of saying, Donald Trump, we're going to help you evade the law. There's lots of caveats there that we can talk about in a moment, but that is, I think, the upshot of where we are today.
And do you mean evade the law simply by the delay in the trial, or are you anticipating, based on what you're seeing in this order today, that this court, 5 justices on this court, could actually find some immunity provisions to apply to this case?
I cannot imagine 5 justices, Lawrence, of the Supreme Court saying that Donald Trump has anything like a serious legal claim here. It is so antithetical to everything we as lawyers, we as citizens think about our government. And the clip you just showed before illustrates the consequences. A president can go and assassinate his political rival and say it's an official act and you can't prosecute him. That's Looney Tunes, to put it mildly. So no, I don't think that's the worry. The worry is the Supreme Court agreed to hear this case and set a fairly slow schedule of hearing it on April 22nd. I know Trump wanted a longer schedule, but still, that's a long time. And for reasons we can talk about, when you start doing the math, there's a real risk that Donald Trump could evade justice and evade this prosecution.
It seems, according to the question that the Supreme Court is asking, that this could be a narrower argument in front of the Supreme Court. There will be nothing about double jeopardy. They seem to, because those are the 2 questions that the Trump lawyers brought to the Supreme Court, the double jeopardy and this immunity for official acts, or, as the Trump lawyers put it, acts that are at the outer perimeter of official duties. It seems that discussion about the perimeter and what is an official act will be the focus of this argument.
That's exactly right. Donald Trump's lawyers had made another argument about double jeopardy, which was even more bogus than their absolute immunity one. And that is really saying something. You got to try to come up with an argument that's weaker than the absolute immunity one. But Donald Trump's lawyers managed to find it. And the Supreme Court didn't bother wanting to hear that piece of it. You're absolutely right. So it does turn on this absolute immunity thing. And the way that the court has written it they've written it in such a way, it says alleged official acts. And by the alleged official acts, they don't mean what the prosecutor is alleging. They mean what Donald Trump, a former president, is alleging. And the idea that someone can just stand up and say, well, because I was a former president, I'm alleging these are official acts, like trying to launch a coup on January 6th. That's an official act, and now you have to evaluate my immunity claim. That can't possibly, Lawrence, be what the law is. So I'm not worried about the Supreme Court ultimately doing the right thing when they hear this case. I'm worried about how long it's going to take for the Supreme Court to do the right thing, and whether the American public is going to be deprived in the interim of actually Donald Trump ever reaching justice. And there's one other point I'd make about this, which has to do with prosecutorial norms, because there is an informational asymmetry here. During this whole delay period, while the Supreme Court hears Trump's case, Trump can go out to the cameras and say the case is bogus and attack Jack Smith and all sorts of stuff. Federal prosecutors don't act that way. They only get to speak through their filings and their presentation of evidence. So now with these months and months of delay, that's great for Trump. He's going to get to claim he's being persecuted without the public ever having the opportunity to actually hear the very persuasive evidence against him, or a jury to hear those things.
You are listening to networksradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
Congressman Goldman, I know you have, in effect, demanded Clarence Thomas's recusal, but he doesn't seem to follow any of the precedents on this kind of issue that we've seen from other justices.
No, and I think we have our answer. If he were to recuse, we would have seen it in today's order, and he's not. And it is absolutely baffling, Lawrence, not just because of the precedent of Chief Justice Rehnquist or then Justice Rehnquist that you point out, but the fact that his wife was involved in the conduct that underlies the criminal charges against Donald Trump, about which he is seeking immunity from the Supreme Court, and Clarence Thomas has not recused himself, is perhaps the greatest ethical lapse that we've seen in a Supreme Court justice. And under the new guise of impeachment that this House Republican majority has created with the impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas, if the Democrats win the House next year, I think we are going to have to think about what our actions are in terms of reining in this rogue Supreme Court, bringing judicial reform and ethics back to the court so that its credibility is restored, and even up into and including the possible impeachment of Clarence Thomas because he continues to flout basic common sense rules of ethics for any judge, much less a Supreme Court justice.
It is Thursday, the 29th of February of 2024, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam. Gunner, the English bulldog, is our snoozing sous chef. Precious, the little Yorkie, is our door girl, and she will be seating you directly for our especially special daily special, Metro Shrimp and Grits Thursdays. A little bit of jambalaya, a little bit of spice in your life. Oh my. Well, we have another busy morning, or have had another busy morning, and a little update on our little Precious. She did go through her oral surgery yesterday, and Dr. Dickey had to pull out quite a few teeth. Now, apparently little dogs, or dogs in general, have like 40 some odd teeth. But he had to take out about a dozen. Oh, God, just the thought of that. Just, oh, my. But, so she was a little loopy when we brought her back. He said that she had still the remnants of a narcotic. And she was, I could tell she was in a bit of discomfort. And Dr. Dickey said not to feed her too much because, she might, get sick. And have to ease in, the fact that there's sutures in there that will dissolve on their own, but you want them to stay sutured so that the sutures, do their work. So a little bit of a concern there, a little bit of care. And as we get her through this oral surgery, as she recuperates in the next couple of weeks, then when she gets through that process, we'll start scheduling the surgeries to fix her kneecaps and her back legs, which are endemic to small dogs in general, Yorkshire Terriers in particular. And that'll help too, because otherwise it becomes degenerative, and she might have to walk around with one of those wheel contraptions tied to her hind quarters, and I don't want to do that. Okay, so we also took my mom to her appointment for the consultation and results of her CAT scan and what the next step will be. And the next step is that she will be getting a stent in her carotid artery, and that is going to be a week from today on the 7th of March. So, a bit of a, mom's, 85, still a bit of a concern. They're not going to put her under in a general anesthetic. They're going to use, I say topical, but you know what we mean. So they'll be giving her some injections there around the neck, and she's going to be awake during this process. Apparently it doesn't take very long. Fortunately, it's not so invasive, but she can't move. And my mom jumps at the slightest little touch, whether you're, coming up behind or you're, coming and, because she's rather sensitive. So hopefully, she can stay still. Making a big deal about it might be the opposite result in terms of the psychology of dealing with most moms of a certain age. If you make a big deal about it, they're going to do the opposite. So one has to tread carefully about giving enough of a concern and being conscious of it without overloading and making her more concerned. And then, some people in the moment of crisis will jump when you need them to be calm. So anyway, there's that. So when this procedure has been accomplished, she'll be getting a lot more oxygenated blood up into her brain, and that is always helpful. Plus, we don't want her to have any strokes. We don't. Not good. So the doctor did say it is a high-risk procedure regardless, but it's not so invasive. And so keeping our fingers crossed for, good outcomes. Yes, we want good outcomes. All right. So looks like with the everybody gets like about $20,000 to go spend as they see fit for their kids to go to school at a school that they see fit. And now I got to tell you, these people pushing this are not hiding the fact that they are racist bigots. The idea of socialism in their heads is the same idea as what the civil rights movement was called, when they were called commies and socialists. All the darkies, they're just commies and socialists. Oh, really? I thought it was, equal protection and due process for all, and what could be more American? Well, apparently that's socialism that's been taught in the schools, and they can't have that. And to teach that the South fought the Civil War over slavery is leftist socialist indoctrination. Okay. So they're just coming right out and saying, yeah, we don't want our kids going to school learning about all this socialism. Okay. We have a word for that, and that's called racist bigot. But we are the racist bigots for discriminating against their whiteness. And I say there, even though, I'm pretty much white myself. Why do I feel apart from them? Well, we better. Because apparently they are a race unto themselves. And I say let them be. Let them be. Unfortunately, they got guns and they're mad. Alrighty. They don't want secular education. Well, okay, go pay for it yourself. If you want your kids to be indoctrinated by PragerU and their historical revisionism, you got to pay for it yourself. No tax dollars for private school tuition. It's very simple. What could be more American? All right. Well, I don't know why I should feel that I'm the one appointed to make that statement over and over and over, but I've assigned it to myself because, little fly in their ointment. Alrighty. What do we have in store for you here as we begin in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy on this fabulous Metro Shrimp and Grits Thursdays? Well, at the top, yes, I did combine a couple of clips there because I felt it important. And the Supreme Court, as Lawrence noted, threw out half of Trump's appeal by taking on his immunity case. Well, Goldman there showed that the court committed the greatest ethical lapse by a Supreme Court justice in history. History! On the rest of the menu, Raw Story, that aggregate, they don't just aggregate, they actually do journalism. Well, they've sued OpenAI for violating the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Virginia lawmakers again declined to put restrictions on the personal use of campaign accounts. Yeah, they just love corruption. And the candidate atop the Republican ballot for Missouri governor says he was only an honorary KKK member, but he does acknowledge going to a religious Christian identity cross-lighting ceremony. Only an honorary one. After the break, we move to the chef's table where traces of toxic gas were found during the evacuation of the Swedish Security Agency, and 2 scientists in Canada were fired for failing to protect sensitive information. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. Are going to tuck right into this first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and it is out of Raw Story by Raw Story. Raw Story, America's largest independent progressive news site, filed suit against OpenAI for using thousands of Raw Story's news articles to train ChatGPT in violation of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Raw Story's copyright-protected journalism is the result of significant efforts of human journalists who report the news, said Raw Story publisher Roxanne Cooper. Rather than license that work, OpenAI taught ChatGPT to ignore journalist copyrights and hide its use of copyright-protected material. Raw Story is a trusted source of breaking political news and investigative journalism, whose mission is to surface underreported news and expose political hypocrisy. Begun as a small one-man political blog, Raw Story grew to become the largest independent progressive news website in America. Today, more than 1 million daily readers consume Raw Story journalism. It is time that news organizations fight back against big tech's continued attempts to monetize other people's work said Raw Story CEO and founder John Byrne. For 20 years, Raw Story has spent millions of dollars in efforts to help Americans make important decisions about their leaders and their lives. Big tech has decimated journalism. It's time that publishers take a stand. Raw Story's lawsuit, filed alongside suits by The Intercept and Alternet, follows a complaint filed by the New York Times alleging massive copyright infringement. For 2 decades, Raw Story has focused on political hypocrisy, white nationalists, and domestic extremists. It received acclaim for its coverage of the Proud Boys in the lead-up to the January 6, 2021 U.S. Capitol attack. Raw Story's expose on a neo-Nazi youth network was featured in last week's Washington Post, and I should say that Raw Story reporter has had her life threatened by the neo-Nazis she's been reporting on. In 2016, Raw Story's Arun Gupta was on the scene when Oregon State Patrol shot and killed a militant who occupied an Oregon State park. You know, the Bundy clan. Raw Story's recent investigations that pursued neo-Nazis and the Proud Boys, who went largely ignored by the mainstream media until the Capitol riot. Editor and publisher has published several articles focused on Raw Story's reporting. In 2022, editor and publisher celebrated Raw Story reporter Jordan Green's courageous reporting in the feature article At the Front Lines on the Home Front. Domestic extremism deserves astute, relentless coverage, but there are few journalists on the beat. According to E&P, Raw Story predicted exactly what would happen that fateful day of January 6, 2021, the morning of the U.S. Capitol riot. Now, Raw Story is also known for its breaking news summaries, which are valuable for AI models because they help train systems to summarize reports. Over the last 20 years, Raw Story has produced more than 200,000 articles, thousands of which were included in data sets used by OpenAI. Raw Story reporters and editors are part of the Washington-Baltimore News Guild, which also represents the editorial staff of the Washington Post. The site's breaking news model, begun in 2004, seeded the formation of other digital publishers. In recent years, Raw Story innovated to support hybrid free and paid investigative journalism, providing a blueprint for expanding critical investigative news reporting, and it was named the best news political blog in America by editor and publisher in both 2022 and 2023. Sarah Rankin of the Associated Press brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Metro Shrimp and Grist Thursdays. Virginia lawmakers yesterday, Wednesday, defeated for another year campaign finance reform legislation that would have prohibited elected officials from spending political donations on personal expenses such as mortgages, vacations, or gym memberships. Virginia, which allows unlimited donations from individuals, corporations, and special interest groups, is a national outlier for lacking such a ban, and advocates at the General Assembly have been trying for more than a decade to put personal use restrictions on candidate spending. Their hopes that a bill would reach GOP Governor Glenn Youngkin's desk this year ended with yesterday's unrecorded voice vote in a House Appropriations Committee, as that measure was the last personal use ban still alive. Another version died in the House of Delegates earlier this session for lack of a hearing. Democratic Delegate Luke Torrain, who chairs the Appropriations Committee, said that both he and Democratic House Speaker Don Scott would like to see the bills pass next year. He didn't explain his reasoning for the delay. So this is going to be one of the priorities that will be before us during the 2025 session, he said. Democratic Delegate Mark Sickles said he reluctantly motioned to carry the bill over to next year. Lawmakers have routinely characterized the issue as something they want to tackle while deferring action on it. Youngkin has not weighed in publicly on the issue, with his office saying only that he would review any legislation that reached his desk. Meaning, I guess he's going to open up the envelopes and see how much cash is in each one. Riverfront Times out of Missouri brings us this final offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. A man with a history of honorary membership in the Ku Klux Klan not only managed to make it on the official ballot to be the Republican nominee for Missouri governor, but may even appear atop the official ballot when GOP voters vote in the primary this August. Those revelations came to light last night when former Missouri Representative Shamed Dogan, Republican of Baldwin, tweeted out a screenshot showing the unofficial candidate filing list for governor posted to the Secretary of State's website. On it, Darrell Leon McClanahan III's name sits atop more well-known GOP contenders like Mike Kehoe and Jay Ashcroft. The candidates' names are listed in ballot order, and because McClanahan drew a low number, his name appears first. A 2022 article on the Anti-Defamation League's website shows McClanahan next to a man in white robes as both men give what appear to be Nazi salutes. And in the picture, looks like it is the Nazi salute. And that was in front of a burning cross sometime around 2019. The ADL article claims that the organization's Center on Extremism has been tracking McClanahan for years, as he has affiliated with various white supremacist and Christian identity groups. The Riverfront Times reached out via text message and asked McClanahan if he was the man pictured in front of the burning cross in the image shared by Dogan. McClanahan replied, "It's an invisible empire. Yes, it's me." But he denied ever being in the KKK. "No, I am not, and I have never been," he wrote back in an accent made up right here on the spot. He then sent a photo of Elvis squaring off in mock fisticuffs with Muhammad Ali. Really? I think Elvis would get his butt kicked. But Later on in the evening, McClanahan sent the following statement addressed directly to Dogan. Shane Dogan, I would like to respectfully request that you cease and desist from making defamatory statements about me on the Twitter platform. He used X, though. Your statement about me being a cross-burning KKK member and white supremacist is false and damaging to my reputation. Well, I would think standing in front of a burning cross giving the Nazi salute has already specified exactly what your reputation is, pal. McClanahan directed the Riverfront Times to a lawsuit he filed against the ADL and its head, Jonathan Greenblatt. The lawsuit concerns the 2022 article on the ADL site, which McClanahan argues was defamatory. In an unusual legal strategy for a man alleging he'd been defamed by assertions he is aligned with anti-Semites and white supremacists, McClanahan says in his own court filing that he is a, quote, pro-white man, horseman, politician, political prisoner activist who is dedicated to traditional Christian values. He also says that he has had honorary memberships in the Knights Party Ku Klux Klan and the League of the South. He also writes that he did attend a 2019 private religious Christian identity cross-lighting ceremony that was falsely described as a cross-burning. Greenblatt and the ADL subsequently filed motions to dismiss the lawsuit, and Judge Jill A. Morris issued an order in their favor just this last December. In it, Morris notes that despite McClanahan's denial of actual KKK membership or white supremacist views, his acknowledged honorary membership in the Knights Party Ku Klux Klan and membership in the League of the South, which supports, quote, Southern secession and the establishment of a white-dominated independent territory means that the ADL's allegations substantially align with the truth. Well, that brings us to our break. And when we get back from that break, we will go through weather from around the world, and we will finish up with the stories that we've curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
Hi, this is Your Health Quickly, a Scientific American podcast series.
We bring you the latest vital health news, discoveries that affect your body and your mind.
And we break down the medical research to help you stay healthy. I'm Tanya Lewis.
I'm Josh Fishman.
We're Scientific American's senior health editors.
Today's episode covers a topic that many parents-to-be have struggled with, fertility. In vitro fertilization offers a path to pregnancy for people who are fortunate enough to be able to access it. But predicting the success of an implanted embryo is hard. Now, researchers are developing a test that could make it easier.
For many people, deciding to have a child, getting pregnant, and giving birth is straightforward, if not easy. But for others, it can be a real struggle, sometimes involving years of treatment and no guarantee of success.
In vitro fertilization, or IVF, is the process of stimulating eggs to develop, fertilizing those eggs outside of the body in a lab dish, and then implanting them in the womb. There, an embryo hopefully develops into a healthy baby.
Right, but for many couples, it's not that simple. IVF can require multiple rounds of grueling egg stimulation cycles, during which the female partner must undergo daily injections of hormones that make the ovaries grow dozens of eggs at a time. These hormones can produce nausea, bloating, mood swings, and other unpleasant effects.
And then a patient must undergo what's called a retrieval. That's outpatient surgery under anesthesia where a doctor retrieves the eggs, which are then fertilized in the lab. The lab tries to grow them for 5 or 6 days, but some don't grow.
Some people will get the embryos, if there are any, tested for chromosomal or genetic abnormalities. Finally, one or more embryos are transferred into the uterus. It's like a Hunger Games tournament. You start out with a bunch of eggs. Only a fraction of those get fertilized. Only a subset will survive to day 5 or 6. An even smaller number will be genetically normal, and only some of those normal embryos will implant in the uterus and develop into a healthy baby.
The whole process is very expensive and time-consuming. For a wannabe parent, it's a lot to go through.
It is, and for many people, there's the added stress of not knowing if it will ever be successful.
Yeah, I've heard that only about 20 to 40% of IVF cycles in people under 40 will result in a live birth.
That's right.
Is there a more straightforward method, a better way to choose embryos that have a high chance of developing into healthy babies?
Well, actually, researchers at the University of California, San Diego have developed a test for genetic material in the leftover media. That is, the soup of nutrients used to grow the embryos. This genetic material could possibly be used to predict the quality of an embryo, which in turn tells you something about its likelihood of developing successfully.
One of the biggest barriers to IVF success is that not every egg, not every sperm, not every embryo will lead to a healthy baby. Individuals and couples go through a lot when they go through IVF, and we are on the hunt for the best way to identify embryos that will lead us to healthy live births.
That's Irene Su, a reproductive endocrinologist and epidemiologist at the University of California, San Diego.
So currently, the way that we evaluate embryos is by how pretty they look, or specifically morphology, their characteristics of how an embryo looks at every stage, or by taking 5 to 10 cells from the blastocyst embryo, and that's an embryo that's usually between 50 to 100 cells, to look at the number of chromosomes.
The embryo's prettiness, or morphology, gives you some idea of how likely it is to develop normally. But many embryos, sometimes as many as half or more, have the wrong number of chromosomes, a condition known as aneuploidy, and many of those will fail to implant in the uterus or develop normally.
So, right now, the only way to know if an embryo is healthy is to look at its structure or to do genetic testing. And that's an invasive and expensive technique that can take weeks or months.
Exactly. Normally, when an embryo created using IVF is grown in the lab before it is ready to be transferred to the uterus, the culture media is discarded. But Sue and her colleague Sheng Zhang wondered if they could use that discarded media to detect genetic material that is released from the embryos, called xRNA.
What's xRNA? And how does it end up in that embryo culture media?
It's a form of genetic material, or RNA, that cells excrete. Scientists aren't sure what it's for, but suspect it's involved in cell-to-cell communication and regulation.
My name is Shen Zhong. I'm a professor of bioengineering in University of California, San Diego. The understanding of how a single cell zygote become a multi-cell organism with different cells carry out vastly different functions is a central question in modern biology.
You can study embryo development in lab animals, but those findings don't always translate to humans. And you can't just dissect a developing human embryo to see what's going on, like which genes are being turned on at which time and other sorts of things.
Right. So Sue and Zhang have come up with a technology called SilverSeq to detect these xRNAs from a very small volume of liquid.
So basically, you can get all of this genetic information about the developing embryo without even touching it?
Yeah, it's completely non-invasive. The researchers detected about 4,000 different xRNA molecules for each of 5 different stages of embryo development. They used the data to train an AI model that could predict the embryo's quality, and it actually worked as well as assessments by human embryologists.
It turned out that using on the order of 50 to 100 genes, the AI model that was trained on those embryos could very well predict the morphology-based quality.
The hope is that you could look at the xRNA profile of an embryo and determine whether it will result in a healthy baby.
And we are not there yet, but we do know that the embryos that continue to grow, they, on average, will have more xRNA than the embryos that stop growing. We know that the xRNA profiles of embryos that ultimately morphologically look better, meaning hopefully they're more competent to become healthy babies, they have a different profile than the RNA profiles of embryos that look morphologically less good.
Of course, this is still an experimental technique. There are a number of steps required before this could be adapted for widespread use in IVF clinics.
I think it's really important that technology is evaluated in evidence-based before we push it out into clinical care. If this xRNA profile turns out to be something that is so promising, then you got to trial it out to see if patients who have embryos picked by using this versus patients who have it used by conventional methods, whether this performs better.
Sue also made the point that reproductive health and women's health are often underfunded.
And so a lot of whether this type of exciting, novel research technology can translate and be applied to human health, early human development, reproductive health, it depends on how much we as a country value this type of science and value its impact on health and are willing to invest in it.
Your Health Quickly is produced by Tulika Bose, Jeff Delvicio, Kelso Harper, Corinne Leong, and by us. It's edited by Ella Fetter and Alexa Lim. Our music is composed by Dominic Smith.
Our show is part of Scientific American's podcast, Science Quickly. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, give us a rating or a review. And if you have a topic you want us to cover, you can email us at yourhealthquickly@sciam.com. That's yourhealthquickly@sciam.com. For Your Health Quickly, I'm Tanya Lewis.
And I'm Josh Fishman.
See you next time.
Hi, it's Tom. Could we humbly suggest your donation to netrootsradio.com? All we've got to run this 24-hour powerhouse of progressive resistance radio is what comes out of our own wallets. And you are our biggest donor. And it doesn't take much, $3, $5. Just go to the bottom of our netrootsradio.com page and hit our secure donate button. Heck, you can even make a recurring contribution. So donate what you'd like at the bottom of our netrootsradio.com's homepage, because you are our biggest donor. netrootsradio.com. Together, we are Resistance Radio.
Let's reflect for a minute on the recent remarks of Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan.
Listen up. This matters. I'm Louis Black, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute with ACLU attorney Bill Newman.
Justice Kagan, during a public conversation at the Library of Congress, avoided saying anything directly relevant to any case before the court. But she did articulate decision-making principles and powerfully shared her perspective on the court discarding precedent. Justice Kagan said, "When the law flip-flops after change in personnel on the court, it doesn't look like law anymore. It looks like a form of politics." She continued, "And I think that's especially important for this Supreme Court at this time. Law should not look like a form of politics, where just because the composition of the court changes, a whole batch of legal rules change with it." Justice Kagan added, "When what was once a right is no longer a right because the court is different, I think that's very damaging to the court, very damaging to society." Justice Kagan did not mention any one of the dozens of examples where this Supreme Court has reversed or dramatically changed long-standing law, but, as Adam Liptak wrote in the New York Times, it was a good bet that the court's 2022 decision overruling Roe v. Wade was among one of the ones on her mind. And let us add, ours too.
The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the American Civil Liberties Union, because freedom can't defend itself.
You're listening to the American Democracy Minute, keeping your government by and for the people. A Delaware Superior Court judge struck down 2 early voting laws February 23rd, affecting tens of thousands of voters who were approved for a permanent absentee ballot list and those who choose to vote early in person. Democracy Docket reports that the lawsuit was brought by a state GOP chair and the conservative Public Interest Legal Foundation in 2022. They argue that Delaware's constitution allows only 1 day of voting, not the 10 days of early voting passed in 2019 and implemented in 2022. Over 55,000 people voted early in the last midterm election, 7% of ballots cast. In his opinion, Judge Mark Connor wrote, "Our Constitution provides only one such day, not any day or series of days the General Assembly sees fit." The GOP plaintiffs also contested a permanent absentee ballot request list passed in 2010 for which voters can qualify if disabled, a state employee, active military, or a caregiver. The permanent absentee list was passed with a bipartisan vote and now has more than 20,000 signed up. Judge Connor noted that this law, too, ran afoul of the state constitution because it added a voter to a permanent list without verifying future eligibility. While the state attorney general says she will appeal, Delawareans needing to vote by absentee should prepare to reapply for upcoming elections. For details, visit AmericanDemocracyMinute.org. I'm Brian Beal.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Metro Shrimp and Grits Thursdays. We always begin weather from around the world along the banks of the Rogue River in the Rogue River Valley of Southern Oregon on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where it is currently 38 degrees Fahrenheit, expecting highs around 38 to 40 and could get even cooler as the day wears on. Rainy conditions at the moment with snow in the offing a little bit later. Winds out of the southwest at 10 to 15 miles per hour. Looks like we're going to get about 3/4 of an inch of rain. And then rain with some snow mixing overnight with lows in the low 30s. Winds out of the south-southwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. And then periods of rain tomorrow, Friday, with highs in the mid-40s. Winds out of the south-southwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. Once again, about getting 3/4 of an inch or more. And then looks like we will be having a mix of rain and snow over the weekend and then rain all next week. Pollen is rated as none here in our little village of Rogue River, Oregon. The air quality index for the region is in the good range at 32 parts per million, and that daytime UV index is low at level 2. Barometric pressure is rising at 29.67 inches. Visibility is at 5 miles, and relative humidity is at 93%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world, and that is the Weather Underground. London is 46 degrees with rain. Paris is 52 degrees and cloudy with a flood advisory. Rome is 58 degrees and partly cloudy with a flood advisory. Bagram is 36 degrees and cloudy. You know, that's in Kabul. The Hong Kong district is 48 degrees and cloudy. Tokyo is 44 with rain. Melbourne, Victoria, Australia is 61 degrees and partly cloudy. San Francisco, California is 54 degrees and cloudy with a wind and flood advisory. Chicago, Illinois is 32 degrees and sunny, and New York, New York is 37 degrees Fahrenheit, cloudy with a small craft advisory. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. Staff at the World Desk of the Associated Press brings us this first amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Metro Shrimp and Grits Thursdays. Traces of a toxic colorless gas were found at the headquarters of Sweden's security agency, where a suspected gas leak last week forced authorities to evacuate some 500 people from the facility. The Daily Svenska Dagbladet newspaper said authorities had found traces of phosgene. The gas has a strong odor that can cause vomiting and breathing trouble, and was used as a weapon in World War I. There were no immediate comments from officials. On Friday, 8 people from the headquarters in Solna, just north of Stockholm, were hospitalized following the evacuation. There were no reports of anyone being seriously injured. Is Sweden becoming part of NATO? Could that have just some coincidental association? Maybe. Those admitted to the hospital suffered breathing problems, authorities said. Some of them were officers who smelled the gas when they arrived at the scene. Authorities asked people living near the Swedish security agency, known by its acronym SAPO, to keep their windows closed after the evacuation. SAPO said that the rescue service had established that there was no gas either inside the premises or outside the building.
Je te donne ce mon amour pour la vie entière, la promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle, c'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer, mes automnes quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers.
And even more staff at the World Desk of the Associated Press brings us this final amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. 2 scientists at a high-security infectious disease laboratory in Canada lost their jobs after reviews found they failed to protect sensitive material and information and did not acknowledge links with China. The scientists, Zhangguo Qi and her husband, Geding Cheng, were stripped of their security clearances in 2019 at Canada's National Microbiology Laboratory over questions about their loyalty to Canada and the potential for coercion or exploitation by a foreign entity. More than 600 pages of a document by the government was made public Wednesday following a special all-party review of the records. The records show Canada's spy agency, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, assessed that Qi repeatedly lied about the extent of her work with institutions of the Chinese government and refused to admit involvement in various Chinese programs, even with evidence was presented to her. The documents are likely to further chill relations between the two countries. Last September, Canada announced a public inquiry into whether China, Russia, and other countries interfered in Canadian federal elections in 2019 and 2021 that re-elected Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberals. Opposition parties hope the documents released on Wednesday yesterday would shed light on why Qi and Cheng were escorted out of Winnipeg's National Microbiology Laboratory in July of 2019 and subsequently fired in January of 2021. The two have not publicly commented and are reportedly living in China. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service concluded that despite being given every opportunity in her interviews to describe her association with Chinese entities, Ms. Chi continued to make blanket denials, feign ignorance, or tell outright lies. A November 2020 Public Health Agency of Canada report on Chi says investigators weighed the adverse information and are in agreement with the CSIS assessment. Investigators concluded that Chi's loyalty remains of grave concern due to her direct contact with the entities linked to a foreign state. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day, but you do know Netroots Radio broadcasts on, and we will meet up here tomorrow for Blue Moon Spirits Fridays. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night for all the breaking news as it breaks, and we will meet up here tomorrow, right here in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théâtres, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Robe à fleurs, sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goël. Je voudrais toujours te plaire, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair. T'embrasser les yeux ouverts, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver.